Buenos dias, Pastor Junior. So I have a word to share this morning. And the title of my message is, our job is not to accept, our job is not to understand God's will, but to accept God's will. Right? The title of my message is, our job is not to understand God's will, but to accept God's will. Right? Once again, the title is accepting God's will, right? Accepting God's will rather than understanding it. Reflecting human limits and divine wisdom. Right? Ahí te va otra vez. The title of our message this morning is accepting God's will rather than understanding it. So accepting God's will rather than understanding it. Reflecting on human limits, right? And divine wisdom. Human limits porque you know, the book of Job, right? I was looking at Job, I was reading right now, Job chapter 14 verse 5. Right? Job 14 verse 5, ¿qué dice? Well, it says that you have determined the number of his months. You have determined the number of his months and you have set limits he cannot exceed. Right? Job 14 5, ¿qué dice? You have determined the number of his months and you have set limits you cannot exceed. You know, you cannot exceed the limits that God has put on your life. You know? So, you know, what do we learn right there? Well, that what God determines both your birth date and your death date. That's what we learned there in Job chapter 14 verse 5. God determines both your birth date and your death date. Right? Job 14 5 otra vez que dice, you have determined the number of his months and you have set limits you cannot exceed. Right? What's the title of our message? Well, the title of our message is accepting God's will rather than understanding it, reflecting on human limits and divine wisdom. Right? You know, once again, it's not our job to understand God's will, but to accept God's will. And, you know, and I was thinking of the major prophet Isaiah. You know, the major prophet Isaiah, ¿qué dijo? Well, the major prophet Isaiah wrote, it says, for my ways are not your ways, wait a minute. It says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Right? Nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. You know, so I know many of us are going through many challenges, you know, right now. I don't know what you're going through personally, but I know there's hardship right now. I know that you know, it's hard. Life's hard, man. You know, but I think that's why the Lord wants me to share this message. Que dice, accepting God's will rather than understanding it. Accepting God's will rather than understanding it. Reflecting human limits and divine wisdom. Right? So Job 14:5 with Isaiah 55:8. Amen. What did we learn there? Well, we learned that faith in action, right? So faith in action is this. True faith, right? True faith means obeying. Right? True faith means obeying. True faith means obeying and trusting, even when life doesn't make sense. Right? Ahí te va otra vez. It says true faith means obeying and trusting, even when life doesn't make sense. Right? So trust that God has a greater positive purpose at work. Right? This is what we learned once again. It says true faith means obeying and trusting even when life doesn't make sense. Right? Trust that God has a greater positive purpose at work. Amen? Orale, God bless you guys. It's the word of encouragement.